Welcome, everybody. I'm super excited to be online giving this presentation to you today. Um, I'm sure a bunch of you work here at the Capitol. We got some folks calling in from outside. So if you haven't been to the Connecticut State Capitol and seen the Hall of Flags, I highly encourage you coming to the Capitol to see that. But today we're going to be looking inside the collection. We're mainly going to be talking about the Civil War flag collection. The Civil War flag collection makes up more than half of our historical flag collection here at the Capitol. So with that, I think we'll get started. I just want to take a quick moment to thank the Capitol Information and Tours group. So Kelly and Kim are very wonderful for putting this together and bringing this idea to me. So thank you very much for putting this together. And I also want to thank the Office of Legislative Management, the office I work for, Brian, my supervisor, for working with me on this collection. And with that, we'll dive in. There we go. So what is the historical flag collection here at the Capitol? Our flag collection is a collection of about 160 historical military flags that were carried or represented Connecticut servicemen and women from the period of the American Civil War to about the Gulf War period. This picture here features the North Case in the Hall of Flags. And in the Hall of Flags, there are about 86 historical flags ranging from those time periods. And I get this question a lot from some folks. What's the earliest flag that we have in the collection? And the earliest flags we have are from the American Civil War period, but we'll get to that and why that is. So talking about some of these designs here, we have some very colorful pictures here to the side. But at the beginning of the American Civil War in April 1861, after President Abraham Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to join the Union Army, and 3 of those infantry regiments are going to be from the state of Connecticut. And of course, they need flags, but the federal government is not going to be the sole responsible party to supply these troops with what they need: uniforms, weaponry, and flags, of course. So the Quartermaster General of the state of Connecticut, William Aiken, he's going to approach a local Hartford artist named Frederick Rice. Frederick Rice's history actually goes back to his father, William Rice. And they're originally from Massachusetts, but they moved here to Hartford. And I would call William Rice and Frederick Rice what we would refer to today as a graphic designer. So William Rice, he's in the business of making business signs or advertisements like that, similar to what you see on the left pictures there. And his son Frederick is going to be his apprentice and eventually take over the family business. And at the beginning of the Civil War, Frederick Rice is going to be approached about making flags for these regiments joining the army. So the A. Phillips Inn sign here, I believe, is from the mid 1820s or the early 1830s. And this was done by his father, William Rice. But you can see where that design directly correlates to the eagle in the canton of the 6th Connecticut Volunteers. It's that eagle in that profile view with the wings somewhat spread. And then in the shield in the canton there, you can see that eagle standing on the federal shield with that scroll that says E Pluribus Unum. The regimental flag design, so these flags would be paired together in what we call a stand of colors. So you'd have one national style flag, and then you would have one regimental or state style flag. And that design comes from the picture on the left there of the Vernon Hotel. And William Rice's design and his son Frederick's designs mainly came from patriotic symbols. So you see in that hotel sign there, they have the seal of the state of Connecticut there with the eagle perched on there with the wings spread. And Frederick is going to use that design for the regimental flags. And then you see in the regimental flag there, you have the seal of the state of Connecticut, and then behind it, the federal shield. So the federal government and the state are working in concert to approach the rebellion. And then on the bottom of there, you see a gold banner that reads 3rd Regiment Convols. So this becomes the formula of what many of the battle flags are going to turn into. And Frederick Rice is going to continue making many of these flags through the war. On the other side, these are double-sided flags. So on the other side, it's the same artwork, but on the regimental flag, instead of being the regimental designation, it would be the state motto, Qui Transtulit Sustinet. Here's a couple blown up images of it. This is the first stand of colors for the 10th Connecticut Regiment of Volunteers. They received these flags in 1861. So again, you can see those Frederick Rice designs there with the eagle, the seal. And then this is actually the reverse side of that regimental flag. So you can see the state motto. And then in some of these flags, they do have like cannons coming out from behind there. So some more military symbolism there. On the national flags, you could see where it once said 10th Regiment, or it would have said 10th Regiment Convols or 10th Reg Convols. They would have shortened those words a little bit to make it all fit. But these flags in size are about 6 foot by 6 foot, more or less. So these are very big flags, and we'll talk about why they're so big very shortly. A couple more Frederick Rice flags here. This is the first stand of colors for the 15th Connecticut. You can see this regimental flag is missing a little more than half of what it originally would have been. And then you could see this very worn national flag of the 15th. And then you can also see there are some names painted on the national flags. Regimental flags have some of them as well, but these are called battle honors. And these are the names of the battles that these regiments were present for or participated in. So many of you probably know the Tiffany and Company, the very fancy jewelry company out in New York City with that famous teal box. But they go back to before the American Civil War, and during the war they were a contractor for the Union Army. So that left picture there, that's actually the Tiffany building. During the war, they're no longer in that building, but that was the building that Tiffany worked out of during the American Civil War period. And then the picture on the right, that is the Quartermaster General of the state of Connecticut, William Aiken. And William Aiken realized he had to get a lot of these flags very quickly. So in the summer of 1862, there is the call for 300,000 more, actually the summer of 1861, after the first Battle of Bull Run. So there's going to be an influx of volunteers rushing to join the Union Army and join these 3-year regiments. And William Aiken has to find flags for these regiments. So he has a close acquaintance, John Almy, and John Almy is a close acquaintance with the Tiffany family. So John Almy, he's going to procure a lot of the Tiffany-made flags for the state of Connecticut. And he gives the Frederick Rice design that we had just looked at to the Tiffany Company. And they're going to make many of these flags in this style, but they also come up with a new painted style and a new embroidered style. So here are a couple of painted Tiffany flags. On the left, we have the one of the national flags of the 11th Connecticut Regiment of Volunteers. And you can see it's that Frederick Rice design with the eagle standing on the federal shield there, with the stars dispersed in the background. And then it would have said 11th Reg Convols, again, that shortened phrasing. And then in 1862, as more regiments are joining the Army, Tiffany and William Aiken come up with a new flag, regimental flag design. And it's going to be this one, where you have the central device, the central area of the flag has the federal shield and the state shield the same size right next to each other. And I think that shows some symbolism that the United States government and the government of the state of Connecticut, those military branches are working together to put down the War of the Rebellion. Also, that's one way that they named the Civil War during that time period. You can see the eagle standing on a scroll, and in its talons, it has arrows on one side and an olive branch on the other. But the eagle is facing the olive branch to show that we're trying to bring peace, or trying to bring peace back to this nation. So we have some of that symbolism there. But then in the central device, you could see that there are these painted scenes behind there. And this is the design that William Aiken and Tiffany come up with to show a little bit of heritage of Connecticut in these flags. So there would have been scenes of the bridge at Norwich, which is the one on the left there, also known as Uncas Leap. So if you're from the Norwich area, you might be familiar with that phrasing. The other side, we have a view from Mount Holyoke. So it's actually up in Massachusetts, but it's a view of the Oxbow in the Connecticut River. And then on the other side would have been a painting of Judge's Cave. And then, of course, we can't leave out the Charter Oak. So the Charter Oak would have been involved there. But this flag is also different in the way that you have the regimental designation on top. So this one was for the 26th Regiment of Connecticut Volunteers. And then on the bottom, you have the state motto there. And then they were also embroidering flags. So these flags, all the artwork on them are embroidered. This is the first stand of colors for the 19th Connecticut Regiment of Volunteers, also known as the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery. When they were brought in, they were also redesignated to the 2nd Connecticut, and they were in the defenses of Washington until May 1864. But these flags, and particularly the regimental flag, it's a similar design to that painted flag, except it is completely embroidered. So those banners, the state shield, the federal shield, the eagle, all of it is completely embroidered. And it's a beautiful flag up close, and these ones are fairly stable. And then in the national flag here, you can see that there is no eagle in the canton. So this one just has the stars, they're white appliqued stars. And then we have the regimental designation in this very fancy, elegant cursive. So 19th Reg Con Vols. And then another source of flags that Connecticut is going to use during this time period is the Philadelphia Depot and the New York Depot. This is a series of depots that are going to have a stock of goods, uniforms, arms and munitions, stuff like that, but they're also going to have flags. The one you see on the left here is a Philadelphia Depot style flag. This one would have been made by a man named Sam Brewer out of Pennsylvania. And he has this design where it's a smaller rectangular canton with an ellipsoidal star pattern of gold stars in that canton. And the whole idea was these flags could be relatively easily produced and quickly and brought out to this influx of troops coming into the army. And instead of doing the artwork of the regimental designations on there, it was the responsibility of the regiment receiving the flag that they would put all of their artwork on there. This particular one was given as a gift to the 29th Connecticut Colored Troops, or the 29th Connecticut Regiment of Volunteers, by their brigade commander as a token of his gratitude for their gallantry and bravery in the field. So they would have been given out that way. These kind of flags also replace some of those Frederick Rice flags. A lot of these are being brought out to these experienced units, these veteran units in the 1864, so the third year of the war. And then on the other side, we have a New York Depot style flag. So, and this actually would have been made by Tiffany. So Tiffany is part of that New York Depot system. And this one belonged to the 5th Connecticut Regiment, and it was given to them in the latter part of 1862. Their Frederick Rice flag they received in 1861 was unfortunately captured at the Battle of Cedar Mountain. So they had this one brought in as a replacement. Um, so a lot of these Frederick Rice flags and some of these early flags that we see, they're also given as symbols of Connecticut communities. There are groups predominantly made up of women of their communities. So we have the Ladies of Hartford, the Ladies of Norwich, the Ladies of Stonington, Wallingford. These ladies would uh, take money, and they would take their money, pool it all together, and they would buy a flag for a particular regiment, because these regiments were made up of men in their community, predominantly, of course, men in their communities. Unfortunately, during this time period, women are not permitted to join the armed services. So, for the most part, men are going to be in these armies. Sometimes women also join in these ranks and disguise themselves as men. But we know about around 400 women that we know of do this. So we're sure there are probably a few more. But these groups come together, present these flags, and it's very much this kind of classical Greek um, sentimental value to it. Like, come back with your shield or upon it. Do your duty to these flags. Do not let them fall into the hands of the enemy. Um, these are presented to you by your communities. So there's also another group in New York on their way. So as these regiments are making their way down to the seat of war, or the theater of war, there's a group called the Sons of Connecticut, New York. And there's actually another one in California, and they present a flag to the 1st Connecticut Heavy Artillery. But the Sons of Connecticut, New York, are working with John Almy to present some flags to some of the regiments coming through. The 8th Connecticut, the 11th Connecticut, and the 10th Connecticut all get at least one flag from that group. So a sentimental value to these flags that the veterans had in mind when they were receiving these. And this image here comes from a Harper's Weekly article, and the Loyal Ladies of New Orleans were presenting a flag to the 13th Connecticut when they were down in Louisiana. Unfortunately, we don't have that flag in our collection. I presume it had been souvenired by the veterans, and pieces of it had been taken home with the veterans or some of the officers. But this is a wonderful depiction of how some of these ceremonies would have looked. So you have these giant, very beautifully made flags, hand painted flags. What is the function and the practicality of having these on a battlefield? During the Civil War, the tactics are still linear warfare. And it's also before wireless communication devices like radios, walkie-talkies, cell phones, and stuff of that nature. So everything has to be done by word of mouth, by orders, by music, um, or an officer riding down to your line and passing orders. So for one, it made it easy for command and control, because an officer, perhaps a brigade commander, a division commander, a corps commander, could look through their binoculars and see where the particular regiments were on a field. Having that particular state design on there, they would know that is a Connecticut regiment. And then we have a graphic here from the Casey's Infantry Tactics. That was the manual heavily used by the Federal Army during the American Civil War. And this is how a regiment would look in order of battle. So you could see the two lines where all the companies are, where all the individual officers are. But right smack dab in the center, you can see where the colors would have been placed. And that is to show where the center of the regiment is. So when these regiments get into these very confusing and chaotic battles, there's smoke everywhere, noise. Regiments are taking casualties. These men have to stay close together in order to complete their tasks. So they'll often be told to dress on the colors. So they're going to file down, fill in those holes, and get closer and closer to the colors. And this just keeps all of those men together. Among some of those functions and practical reasons of the flags are to generate an esprit de corps. all of these regiments are very proud of their flags, and not only for the patriotic aspect, but also because these are their particular flags. All of these flags are very different. The way that some of these regiments get these flags are very different, and they're very proud of the fact that these are their particular flags. Um, Also, like I said, they would have had their battle honors on there. They were very proud of those, even down to the wear and tear on these flags, because that meant they were an experienced unit. They had been in the Army for a while, and they were very, very proud to protect and carry these flags. It was actually considered an honor if you were selected to carry the colors or you were put on the color guard. Now, the color guard was a group of about 10 men selected from different companies in a regiment to guard that particular flag, and their sole purpose was to protect the colors. If the color bearer went down, it was their task to pick it back up and keep going. And as you would imagine, in this style of linear warfare, a lot of the color guards in different regiments are going to take naturally high casualties. Um, Now, there are some very great gallant and bravery acts that are going to take place surrounding some of these colors because it was considered disgraceful or a dishonor if your flag fell into the hands of the enemy. And there are some very intense things that occur. I also just quickly want to talk about these two photos here. We have two men from different Connecticut regiments. The first one, we don't know his identity, but he's a sergeant holding the first national flag of the 6th Connecticut. That was the national flag in the first slide. And then this is Sergeant Michael Cronin of the 9th Connecticut Regiment of Volunteers, also known as the Irish Regiment. And he's carrying that national flag of the 9th, which we'll see in just a couple slides. So some of the acts of gallantry and bravery I wanted to touch on because some of these stories are so riveting, and we wouldn't almost believe that people did these things and put their lives on the line to protect these flags. So the 16th Connecticut Regiment of Volunteers, also sometimes dubbed the Unfortunate or Unlucky Regiment, they had gotten themselves sometimes into some sticky situations at different battles, not to their own uh, discredit, but they ended up in these situations, like the Battle of Plymouth in April 1864, at the Siege of Plymouth, North Carolina. The Confederates were converging on a very small amount of Union troops, including the 16th. And on the third day of the battle, under fire, Lieutenant Colonel John Burnham, that's the man in that first photo there, he's going to order the regimental colors be brought to him, and he's going to order them to be destroyed because he would rather have those flags destroyed than to fall into the hands of the enemy. And the picture you see on the left there is what remains of that flag. A lot of these men ended up in various Confederate prison camps, like the notorious Andersonville prison camp, where a lot of men passed away due to malnutrition and disease. Um, but these flag pieces that they saved at Plymouth were hid in their uniforms, and they went to these camps with them. And a good amount, a large number of these men are actually going to die in camp. And so these are the remaining pieces that were brought back together after the war in preparation to bring these flags to the Capitol here in Hartford. The second set of photos here is for the 18th Connecticut Regiment of Volunteers, June 1863, at the Second Battle of Winchester, Virginia. There was a large Confederate Army Corps on their way to Gettysburg, part of the Gettysburg campaign, and they outnumber this federal force, and the 18th Connecticut is part of this force. As the federal troops are withdrawing from Winchester, their division commander, Robert Milroy, orders the 18th Connecticut to make a stand and buy time for the rest of the division to leave. There was talk that he promised to bring reinforcements in from another brigade. Those reinforcements don't show up. So the 18th Connecticut hold on, but their colonel, William Ely, realizes that he's going to have to surrender his command, the 18th. So he orders Sergeant Torrey, who is in the second photo here, pictured as a captain later in the war. he is ordered to destroy the flag, but Torrey has another idea. He takes the regimental flag off the staff, wraps it around his body, and hides it underneath his coat. And he and a handful of other men are able to escape that Confederate encirclement before the regiment is captured. And luckily, to his quick thinking, we have that flag here in the collection, and we hope to put that on display very soon. We'll touch these stories quickly. We have the Battle of Fort Gregg right at the end of the American Civil War, April 2nd, 1865. The 10th Connecticut actually was part of an assault on Fort Gregg, part of the Petersburg line. And Sergeant Allen Tucker here was awarded the Medal of Honor for gallantly and bravely carrying the 10th Connecticut's national flag in this assault. And he's one of the first to place his flag on the Confederate earthworks there. George Phillips, who was carrying the regimental flag of the 10th, was given a citation, and he was promoted for doing a similar act as Tucker here. That's a photo of Tucker in Washington, D.C., shortly after the surrender of Confederate forces. And he's with a larger group of other federal soldiers carrying captured Confederate flags on their way to be brought to the Secretary of War. And then the last story I'll tell you quickly here is the Battle of Cedar Mountain, August 9th, 1862. So we're going a little bit back in time. Captain George Corliss, who is pictured here, he's part of the 5th Connecticut Regiment at Company C. And during the Battle of Cedar Mountain, they're under a withering Confederate fire. And up to 8 men had fallen, killed or wounded, carrying the regiment's colors. But they are doing their best to keep them up. And Corliss quickly grabs this regimental flag that you see here, and he leads the men forward until he himself is wounded, but he does not let the flag fall. He wants that flag to be visible for his men to keep going forward, so he keeps it up until he is relieved of the flag, and he's taken off the field. But he was awarded several years after the Civil War in 1897 for that act of gallantry and bravery. And these images here of him and his Medal of Honor come from the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History over on Elizabeth Street here in Hartford. So a lot of these flags have a lot of damage on them. I mean, you can see this central photo here of what remains of the 17th Connecticut's flag. They were one of a few other Connecticut units that were at the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the largest battles and notable battles of the Civil War. But a lot of these flags have all this damage on them, and not all of it is done due to combat. So these flags will be used on a daily basis for dress parade, inspection, battalion drill, and other everyday occurrences. So just as a flag that you might have on your house or over the school or over the Capitol, over time, they will, just from being in the wind on a constant basis, those will deteriorate. So we can attribute some of this damage and a lot of it to some of that, but also we can tell there is some combat damage on these flags. The way when a mini ball, which is the main projectile during the Civil War, flies through a silk banner like these, the way that the silk is woven is so when it tears, it's not just like a round hole that goes through it. We can see vertical splitting because those tears will split vertically. So we'll see here, this is an example of one of the staves that some of these flags similarly would have been carried on. And this is the staff of the first national flags of the 11th Connecticut. This was actually a Tiffany design in where there was a brass sleeve over a joint, and that joint would allow the flag staff to fold at least 1/3, so make it a little more rooly to carry. But you could see it is engraved 11th Regiment Convols from the Sons of Connecticut in New York, December 1861. So these staves themselves have a sentimental value to them. And in the right-hand photo there, you can see that this staff has literal wounds. This staff had been struck in combat, several times. More notably, you could see that crack in the middle there had been just struck by some sort of projectile, and then there's another gouge taken out closer to the top. These straps here are part of a canteen strap, probably from one of the men who carried the flag, that was used to help stabilize it because they just didn't have another one lying around, so they had to make do with this one. And they also didn't want to just get rid of it. So they did their best to keep that staff stable. And I absolutely love that that strapping is still there 160 plus years later. So another reason for damage on the flags is that after the war, when the flags were brought back to Connecticut, they were deposited at the state arsenal, and a lot of the flags were parts of them were souvenired. And a great example of this is the national flag of the 14th Connecticut Regiment, one of the more notable Connecticut regiments in the Civil War. They're part of the Second Corps in the Army of the Potomac. They're at almost every major engagement from Antietam to Appomattox. Um, and the color bearer, John Hurst, he was one of them. He, after shortly after the Battle of the Wilderness in May 1864, he cut out a star and an O from Con in the regimental designation, and he sent them home to his brother Benjamin, who served in the 14th. And these pieces are in the collection of the New England Civil War Museum, which is in the old Burpee Post at the GAR Hall in the Vernon Town Hall, which is now the New England Civil War Museum. And they made their way to the GAR Hall there, and they've been there ever since. So these pieces directly correlate, and we can see that it meant a lot to these veterans that they had a piece of their flag to take home. This other flag you see in here is the regimental flag of the 14th Connecticut. This is their second one they got, so we can see from the layout it would have been one of those picture flags, but it was heavily souvenired at the end of the Civil War and before Battle Flag Day in 1879. So none of that central device is with the flag, unfortunately, but a lot of that went with those veterans. So I just mentioned Battle Flag Day in 1879. So when this Capitol building was completed in 1878 and the first session took place in 1879, the west entrance of the Capitol building was set aside for the Hall of Flags. And they put this massive parade together to bring the flags, which were deposited at the State Arsenal, which it was closer to where Dunkin' Donuts Park is in Hartford now. And there was this massive parade, thousands of spectators, veterans, some notable Civil War military figures were in attendance that day. And it was a very emotional ceremony for these veterans because this was the last time that they were going to be able to march and handle their flags that they carried in the Civil War. These flags represented the friends they had lost during the war, the battles they served in, and of course the people that gave them these flags. And so the flags were brought here to the Capitol, and they're put in the Hall of Flags so that the General Assembly and the public of the state of Connecticut can view these flags and see those tattered flags that had seen the din of battle. And this is one of my favorite etchings. It's from this book, The History of Battle Flag Day, and it is a woodcut of the veterans placing their flags in the west entrance there. And if you look at this photo and you go closer to the window, you could see that those sight lines match up almost perfectly. So where does the conservation and the preservation of the flag start? So it actually starts in the Civil War. When the flags are damaged, the color guard, those men handling the flags directly, are going to do their best to patch them up. And we have a good example of that right here. This is from the regimental flag of the 26th Connecticut. So you could see there's that needle and thread work to keep that painted area together. And then when one of these regiments was getting a new flag, or they were interring it at the state arsenal, to protect that painted area, almost how we use acid through tissue nowadays, they were using newsprint. So this is a period piece of newsprint that had adhered itself to the flag prior to Battle Flag Day. Fast forward to the 1930s. Some of you are familiar with this name, Catherine Fowler Ritchie. She is a flag, or was a flag conservator in the 1930s and the 1940s, and she works on a number of our flags. Most of the flags that she worked on are in the Hall of Flags still. But her method was, I tried to sketch it up in a diagram here. She would take a natural or a dyed linen backing, and she would put the original flag on that. And then to put that all together, she would take a silk netting and put that on top of the original flag. And to adhere all of that together, she would use a very intricate zigzag-like stitching embroidery pattern over the entire flag to keep it all together. And then the flag was put back on the staff and put in the case. These flags tend to be among the more fragile and brittle ones that are in the collection, and we have to keep a close eye on these due to that. Here are some of the flags that she worked on. This is the first stand of colors of the 9th Connecticut Volunteers, the Irish Regiment, as plainly seen in the regimental flag here. We have those Frederick Rice designs here, but instead of the seal of the state of Connecticut, they elected for a green harp of Erin. Now, these flags were conserved by Catherine Ritchie, and you can kind of see in this area that has some fading damage, you can see that zigzag pattern in that blue area there. And then we have a nice close-up here of a couple cantons. That embroidery stitching was also done through the painted areas of the flag. And it was all the thread was used to enhance some of those images. But part of the problem with the way this was conserved is that over time, all those tiny, tiny little holes are eventually going to get more brittle, more fragile, and they will fragment, which we'll see in this next slide here. This is an eagle wing here from the 6th Connecticut flag. And one of the detriments to the conservation method here is that it is 80 plus years old. So just the conservation materials themselves are slowly deteriorating, in which we can see here. And this is that breaking up that I just talked about, that these little holes, they get so fragile, eventually they fragment, they connect to another one, and then they fragment. And that's partly due to the unregulated humidity levels that are in there. So sometimes the flags aren't getting those moisture levels that they need to stay structurally intact. But we are looking into ways to how we can reintroduce that humidity to the flags. Also, we have light fading, and a lot of that netting, that silk netting, is deteriorating in and of itself. Fast forward to the 1960s, Colonel Thomas Welter, who's a colonel in the U.S. Army, he is doing some conservation work on the Connecticut battle flags, and he's using a synthetic silk netting, which lasts a lot longer, but he's also going to use a sewing method, and he runs the flags through a sewing machine that does a zigzag-like pattern, but he also reintroduces the flag to moistures. I don't think that's something that Catherine Ritchie did when she conserved the flags, but they might have been in a lot better shape than they are now when she did that work. So Thomas Welter, he's going to reintroduce some of that moisture to these flags, and these flags generally are in a lot better condition, more stable condition, but they are still fragile. They are still 160 years old. This flag here is the 3rd regimental flag of the 1st Connecticut Heavy Artillery. So an infantry flag would have been blue, an artillery flag would have been red. And of course, you could see all those battle honors on 1975, there's a conservator named Denise Morris Kurt. She's conserving a few of the flags in a way that she's using plastic to basically vacuum seal the flags inside plastic. But those flags are also adhered to the plastic. So unfortunately, it's an irreversible process, and it's not a way that we would conserve a 160-year-old flag now. But to its own credit, these flags are fairly stable due to being in that plastic, and it has the support of that plastic. So we do have a few of these flags, and another great example of a Frederick Rice flag. You have that eagle standing on the shield, and this one is a little more complete, so you can see 12 regged CV as well. And then going forward into the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, my predecessor, Jerry Kaufman, her team that she was working with some folks from Yukon, her husband, Bill Kaufman, and their friend, Fran Moyer, they built the foundation of what the flag collection is now. They created an extensive reports file, condition report file on all of these flags, and put a lot of the researched a lot of the history behind these flags, and we're continuing to do that. But we are building on what Jerry, leading that conservation, put together. And she put together what we see in the Hall of Flags now. So it's not just the Civil War flags. We have flags from the Spanish American War, World War I, World War II, the Korea and Vietnam time period, and up to the Gulf War period that she curated that display. And how are we going forward with all of this? That's a lot of stuff to go over, and how do we take all of that and move forward with it? So for one, right now we're still going through, we're assessing a lot of the damage on these flags. What's the general condition of them? Assessing the environmental damages, the fragility of these flags, and then if they're stable enough, we do give them a preliminary cleaning, give them a very light, delicate vacuum cleaning to remove any foreign sediment or debris or surface dust that it has accrued for being on display for so long. We're also creating a triage list. So when all the flags get a report made for it, I put it on a list and I color code it. So if the flag is very, very fragile and really requires textile lab attention, those will be labeled red. Red or yellow is, not as bad, but it will still require some attention. And then green is stable for display. We're also working with a few conservators to stabilize our flags that are in very critical condition, so they can stabilize these in their textile lab, and then we can bring it back to the collection, and we can put it on a flat pressure mount display, so you can see the whole flag, but also no stress is being put on those textiles. The other thing that is very important to all of this is conveying the stories behind these individual flags. Yes, they are old flags. They look very nice in the hall, but we want to go beyond that and tell the individual stories of what happened to some of these units. Is there a riveting story behind some of the flags that we can tell and bring some of those stories home? So when you come into the Hall of Flags, or you look in the lower concourse where we have some flag displays, you can look and see what those regiments did and where these flags went, and what sort of service they saw. And also working to digitize all the records that we have here on the flag, so they're available to researchers, they're available to descendants, people who are trying to build their knowledge behind these flags because they might have had a family member or they are studying them for school. Just so all of that information is accessible. And then, of course, ensuring the preservation of these flags going forward. Of course, we're not going to take them out of the Hall of Flags and hide them away from display, but we want to preserve these for another generation, just as the veterans wanted. And one thing I wanted to quote is from the History of Battle Flag Day. Again, it was such a uh, sentimental and it was a very emotional experience for these veterans because they knew they were handing these flags over in the trust of the state of Connecticut that they would take care of them. And Governor Andrews, who was the governor of the state of Connecticut in 1879, addressed the veterans as follows. General Hawley and the veterans of Connecticut, in the name and on behalf of the state, I accept these flags from the hands of the men who carried them in war. For more than 4 years of conflict, wherever the camp was the hardest, wherever the siege was the fiercest, wherever the march was the longest, wherever the fight was the sorest, they were always to be seen. For all that period, through all the smiting suns of the south, through all the blasting winds, through summers and winters and all alternating seasons, they were at all times unfurled. They come back to us riddled by shot, tattered and torn, blackened and grimmed with the smoke and powder of battle, but they bring to us no word of flight or dishonor. Lovingly then, and tenderly, let us lay them away in the motherly arms of the state, whose trophies they now become, that they may teach the lessons of patriotism and duty to all future generations. And I think that really sums up the work that I'm doing and the wonderful work that my volunteer team from the New England Civil War Museum, Dan, Kara, Wayne, and then Bill and Kim, who have helped out with this flag collection. That really sums up why we're doing this work. Thank you for tuning in to this presentation today. If we have some time for some questions, I'd be glad to answer. But thank you for tuning in. Oh, I see we do have one question. Why does the number of stars vary throughout many of the national flags? So they generally stay between 34 and 35 stars, just because that's how many states were in the Union at the time. In 1863, West Virginia becomes its own state, and they become the 35th state in the Union. So generally 34 or 35 stars, but there was no regulated pattern for the Army flags. For the Navy, there was a regulated pattern of what the flags had to be. But for the Army, yes, you had to have a state and a national style flag, but those stars were not particularly required to be in any particular order. They just had to be there. Very good. Oh, we have another one. Oh, thank you very much. As you move forward, will you be developing a budget for the continuous preservation of the flag, of the flags? We do have a budget to work with within the Office of Legislative Management. And we are working with that budget. We could probably do about 2 flags a year at this time, but we'll see if maybe we can expand that in the years to come. Here we go. Here's another one. One question we get a lot is how can small museums best store their flags? One thing I could probably tell you, especially with very old textiles or heirloom textiles like these, I would say storing them flat or storing them on an acid-free tube, like a 10-inch diameter acid-free tube, would help preserve these flags very long. But I think the more popular way to do it is to store them flat. That way, there's no sort of tension on any fiber of the flag other than it is just laying down relaxed. And then, of course, using acid-free materials like acid-free tissue, board, and then when you're displaying them, pressure mounts with UV filtering glass. Did you explain why some of them are so large? No, I don't think you missed that. Maybe I missed that. So some of these flags are so large just because they have to be visible on the battlefield. A commander needs to be able to see where their units are, and the soldiers themselves need to see where the center of their line is and see where their flags are. So that's why they're so big. just so everybody can see them. And of course, that turns into the enemy being able to see them as well. But of course, on the Confederate side, they're using flags in a similar nature. So with that, I know we have a lot of people who work at the Capitol on here. Like I said earlier in the presentation, if you have time to come to the Hall of Flags, please come see the Hall of Flags. It is a wonderful representation of what the west entrance of the Capitol looked like in 1879 when the veterans brought their flags here. But also we can still see those flags up close, and we can take the time to appreciate, but we can also take the time to reflect what these flags meant for the soldiers who carried them, for their communities, but what they also mean for us in 2024. What do these flags mean to us? What does that memory mean for you individually? Let's see. Great. And with that, thank you again to the Capitol Information and Tours and League of Women Voters for putting this on. Thank you so much.